yet.
Oh,
Another half hour.
Say hi to her for me.
I will.
Is she right there?
No.
No. Okay. All right. Well. Okay. Well, like Churchill to Roosevelt, we are talking across the Atlantic, and we'll be as useful as Roosevelt was, and we're going to rely on Adam because Adam had some good thoughts. Todd, I don't know about you. It may be the algorithm. I feel as though I am required to have a position on the recent Bonhoeffer movie that has been released by Angel Studios. And in order to justify myself, I'm pulling Adam into this conversation. And in part because some of Adam's thoughts, they weren't necessarily my thoughts, but they were my thoughts underneath a lot of unexamined kind of gut reactions. And so Adam, I want just remind people who you are and where you are, and give us your hot take.
Remind them, because they know who I am already. I just have to say it out loud. I'm that well known. Yeah. So I'm Adam Morton. I used to be a Lutheran pastor in the United States. And for the last couple of years, I have been in Nottingham, England, teaching theology at the University of Nottingham.
Once a Lutheran pastor, always a Lutheran pastor, though. Right?
It's true, but this is such a different environment. It's, as I try to describe it to people, like this is like teaching theology at a Big Ten university. It's like a 40,000 student public research university with campuses in 3 countries.
That's crazy.
And we are a weird little sliver of it, though this semester we get dumped into a much larger department. I'm actually now part of the philosophy department here, which has like 40 people teaching in it.
Oh, wow.
So
wow.
Anyway, so I'm a philosopher by administrative fiat.
Well, and there you go. And that shows that you are more of an authority than I even made you out to be.
There you go.
But yeah, so you are an academic, you are a theologian, you are a Lutheran pastor. So more so than Todd Littleton, the Southern Baptist pastor.
Correct.
You know of what we speak here, and so start with just your thoughts about the conversation around the film.
Yeah. So and admittedly, I was definitely among those that had slightly alarmed reaction. So I guess my reaction to the conversation goes back to several years back, Metaxas's Eric Metaxas's Bonhoeffer biography, which definitely did some things in it. Mainly, it strongly suggested to me this guy doesn't understand German Lutheranism as a context at all. And so I was hardly alone in thinking he's putting him to a cultural use here, which is just, never mind one's judgments about whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. It's simply not true to Bonhoeffer.
So, okay, that's helpful. So, Metaxas portrayed Bonhoeffer as kind of the equivalent of an American evangelical standing up against an authoritarian regime. What is the German Lutheran context with which we should understand him?
There's a degree of liberalism there, but it's not even the American version is the thing. German theology in the first half of the 20th century is its own animal. Bonhoeffer comes along. He's undoubtedly he's out of a secular family, but there's a kind of a secularized cultural Lutheranism in that part of the world, which is still sort of inescapable, but it's a Lutheranism very much inflected in many ways by through like Immanuel Kant and, big German cultural ideas. But also at that time, you've got really sort of exciting things happening in theology. This is the time period of Karl Barth in his ascendancy, and Barth is reacting against German liberal theology, but that's also caught wind of Luther. One of the main things happening is a serious revival of Luther that goes back to, I suppose there was some interest at the close of the 19th century because 1883 was the 400th anniversary of Luther's birth. And so there were things that the that the German government did around that. But around 1900, a Dominican named Heinrich de Neifle, who was a Vatican librarian, rediscovered Luther's Romans lectures. There were no known copies of at that time in the Vatican archives.
It's like a Dan Brown novel.
Yeah, exactly. And what does he do with it? Well, this is great. So first of all, he reads this, and then he writes this massive 2-volume just carpet bombing of Luther. But he had all of the Protestant scholars on their back foot because he had access to materials they'd never seen. And so an arms race kind of starts over Luther. First of all, then it wasn't very long after that a copy of the Romans Lectures was rediscovered in Germany. Then you start getting this really intense reappraisal of Luther and rereading, and the birth of what we call the Luther Renaissance.
Okay.
And that's being pulled in various directions. And the figures involved in it are a who's who of German theology at the time. Karl Hull and Ernst Troeltsch, and as he actually comes along, Barth, very, very involved in this. And they all have different views on sort of how to read Luther, how to pull him in one direction or another. What kind of a Protestantism is he going to represent? And so Bonhoeffer is in this, but an awful lot of it is he is reacting against a form of liberal theology, but it's a form of liberal theology that I'm very hesitant to identify closely with what we would think of as liberalism.
Yeah.
In an American context. It is to some degree secularizing, to some degree moralizing, shy about metaphysical claims on account of Kant. This sort of an impulse, or like Hull, it could be a reading of which has a degree of liberalism in it, insofar as he wants to talk mostly about sort of the individual conscience. And Bonhoeffer, in many ways, is pushing back towards a more traditional Lutheranism, though calling him simply a traditionalist would be, I think, quite wrong.
So one of the things you're brushing up against is, I think one of the reasons why people should be wary about how they read and how they use Bonhoeffer is that he's almost like a sphinx. I mean, that depending on where you read him and where you dip in, you can create a varied portrait of who he was and what his theology is about.
Yeah.
Something like a Rorschach test.
Yeah, and one of your points, Adam, is that we only because he was martyred, we only have the theology of a still developing theologian.
Yeah, I mean, he died at 39 years old. You know, I think I still think of myself as a young theologian, and I'm 46. And so I think about that, and I realize, I mean, if you'd asked me when I was 30, is 39 a young theologian, I would not have said so. But at this point, I'm going, you know what? There's something to Christian theology where reaching sort of maturity and stability takes a long time.
Well, yeah, because I mean, you think that, tonally the difference between Barth's Romans and Church Dogmatics 4 towards the end of his life, like tonally, they're completely different.
Yeah, they are. They are. There are points that are still recognizably okay. That's the same guy, but whoo boy, has he gone through a lot of moves. Or you read Luther in 1516 in the Romans Lectures versus 1535 in the Great Galatians. Actually, because those are even lectures only from 1531. So that's only 15 years difference. There's a massive theological difference there.
I mean, Bonhoeffer could have gotten grouchy in his old years, like Luther did.
So this is a point I made, is if he hadn't died, there. Not only would his theology eventually have probably stabilized more, but he would have been involved in all of the same troubles that all of the rest of the post-war Germans were, which means wrapped up in defending where were you and what were you doing and who were you involved with and what is Germany as a country and as a nation and what's the German church and what can Christianity be after all of this. And it's conversations that don't leave anyone feeling like a hero anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Bonhoeffer represents absolutely a certain kind of resistance, but so do some other guys. I think of Ernst Käsemann, who was extremely anti-Nazi, but he can't avoid getting drafted, sent off to the front, and well, not exactly to the front, but yeah, to various roles. And so he's involved in it. He's complicit in it, whether you like it or not. And actually, if you read Bonhoeffer carefully, he says he is too. So there's a real problem with, I think, particularly from the English-speaking world. We had the advantage of just being the good guys, right? World War II for us was a matter of shooting at stormtroopers. It's a Star Wars movie. And if you're German, even if you were one of the good guys, whatever that means, it wasn't that. It was morally compromised. To extend the Star Wars analogy, boy, I never expected to do that.
They're all like Andor.
It's Andor, exactly. Oh man. Okay. Well, then that's much, much harder. But it's even harder for an American to understand. And an awful lot of our English language work on Bonhoeffer is by people who haven't sunk all the way into that. I mean, there are absolutely scholars and specialists who've understood that very well. And I do not want to denigrate anyone's good work on Bonhoeffer. That was not the point of my post. There's very valuable work on the man. It's more like he's so difficult to understand from an American cultural context because as Americans, we got to both win and feel good about it.
This is one of the reasons I think this is helpful is Todd's heard me complain about this before, but I feel like there are a whole lot of Christians and especially clergy who cite Bonhoeffer without having read much of him. There's a few passages in discipleship that get thrown around. But much like St. Paul, there's a lot more talk about him than reading of him, which means what you're really citing is the biography, the timeline. And you've done a good job of complicating that history, right? Because one of the things I think would make people uncomfortable if they really sat with it is just how invested Bonhoeffer was in saving and revitalizing German culture. That he's a more complicated figure than just the resistance martyr.
Yeah, he is. I mean, and I think for anyone I may say this of never having been in a situation remotely close to that, it's hard for me to imagine. But how you'd be constantly second guessing your own complicity in everything. Who your friends are, where you've worked, whether I've supported the wrong institutions just a few minutes too long, whether I supported the wrong politicians just a few minutes too long. There's the idea that you could come out clean, sort of, you could come out of that with your virtue intact. This may actually be what makes Bonhoeffer a very good Lutheran, is he's insisting you can't come out with your virtue intact. That's already lost.
So Todd, as someone who is a pastor in the deepest of red America, okay, I'm sure there will be some sort of self-evaluation in your neck of Christendom at some time in the future. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are here.
Well, I'm going to be in that group of people who haven't read enough of Bonhoeffer, but at the same time, wise enough to let someone like Adam talk about Bonhoeffer,
There are people who read
or
an awful lot more of him than I have.
or Jeffrey Pugh, for that matter. I think what I take when watching this sort of thing go on, knowing that it's not the only figure in theological history that gets pulled apart and used for someone's own purposes. I think that to say that at some point there'll be a future evaluation. I mean, I'll be gone when that happens, but maybe that will be the case. I wonder if there'll be the same sort of complexity in the sense that um, I don't know that we know everything about our own particular contextual moment at present.
Hmm.
So, will there be some things that come to light that complicate decisions and positions? In my current place, I don't really see how. And the only reason I say that, I add that information is so readily available now, and it's very hard to hide things, although I think they can be hidden. That I think there'll be a greater sense that, boy, this turn was not very good turn, or that turn was a very terrible turn. But I just wonder, based on what you observed about reading Paul, if if the if the need to have an opinion is greater than the need to make sure you have a good opinion, wins the day. And I think today that there is that need to have an opinion and not enough time taken to see whether or not we have a good opinion.
That's wise.
So
And that's really wise. And Adam, that relates to what you wrote about. What Bonhoeffer really reveals is our need to have a good guy,
Yeah.
like
I
a
mean,
good German.
I really think it does. I likened it to, so there's something I first encountered years ago, and it took me a long time to figure out why it made me uncomfortable. Bonhoeffer himself, his own writing doesn't make me uncomfortable in this way, but the use of the figure does. But there's somebody else I encountered, a name that I just kept feeling like I shouldn't know this name, and the name is Sophie Scholl.
Hmm.
Sophie Scholl was a student um, under the Nazi regime, just a German girl who, together with her brother and maybe a couple of friends, they're often described as the part of the White Rose resistance, student resistance movement. It was literally, they printed like some flyers and came up with a name and stuck them up somewhere. And then she and her brother were found out and ended up being executed. They had no impact whatsoever. It's a pure monstrous tragedy. And you think, why would people seize on this? Because it's not to talk about the tragedy, it's to talk about the heroism and resistance. And you're like, they didn't do anything. It clicked with me that the use of Bonhoeffer is an awful lot like that. It's never mind what he wrote, and there's tremendously valuable things in what he wrote. I really hope that nobody. So I have a friend, a pastor theologian friend named Josh Miller, who's sort of chastised me for suggesting people not read Bonhoeffer. I really do not mean to say that. People should read him, and they should gain from him. But I'm very skeptical in how he's being used in public conversation, because it's all about how, if the subtext is, well, what he means is that if any of us were in a position like that, here's what we could do to resist and how we could come out as the good guys.
Mm-hmm.
How in the totally compromised environment of Nazi Germany, somebody could still be pure and honorable. but I don't think he shows us that. And I'm very skeptical of efforts for those of us who've never been in that situation to show how we could possibly be honorable in that situation.
Yeah, and we use him. What I've noticed in the conversation around this film is now we're using him to virtue signal our own goodness in our current culture war. I don't know how many pastors I've seen post something about exhorting their people not to go watch this movie, and instead and read Charles Marsh's biography or and so what's really going on there is uh, it's a culture war stance against all that Eric Metaxas represents, disregarding the fact that like the movie's not based upon his biography. It just has a similar subtitle. Like it's just.
I have a couple of friends who went to see it separately from one another. Both of them Lutheran pastors. Both of them extremely well-educated guys. Both of them read German well. One of them really enjoyed the movie and was comfortable with the historical distortions, which he knew were historical distortions. The other one was not as comfortable with those distortions, had some misgivings about the film, but didn't think it was awful. I guess I reserve the right not to have an opinion on the movie.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's that important.
Listening to you talk about that, I can't help but think that one piece that complicates is I've got to market a film.
Mm-hmm.
And so since I've got to market a film, what's already in the ether that I can capitalize on, even if it's not the same thing, to get you to come see the movie. So it's an odd thing that draws us, when, well, I got to go find out, is it like the Metaxas biography or is it contra the Metaxas biography? So it was a marketing move, I think, more than it was anything else. Who's going to come see this film? Well, we've got to agitate the already agitated to get them to come see the film.
Putting a gun on his hand in the poster it's extraordinary. It's like, is he an assassin? They called him that on the line. You're like, what?
Right.
Well, I mean, it's no different that I know people on the left, like, deeply uncomfortable with some of those old photographs of Karl Barth sitting on a horse with a rifle on the Swiss border. This is just like, it's not everything needs to be a weapon in our own culture wars.
What figure is pristine anyway? That's the other side. What historical figure is as pristine as we want them to be or need them to be? None. So it's a bit naive.
I mean, there have been some of even the remarks from his own family. You're like, well, surely this is, a bastion of authority on Bonhoeffer. And then I read remarks by his great niece, who is claiming that his project was basically a secular liberal one. And none of this is remotely true. Even his family's using him for weird ideological purposes.
Well, they didn't want him to become a pastor in the first place. Yeah, right? That's a question I wanted to ask you guys, because I have seen people encourage others not to see this movie because the Bonhoeffer family has taken a stance against how he's been used. But my thought is Bonhoeffer belongs to the church now, not to his family. In the same way that Paul belongs to the church, and I feel like, if we could teleport Paul to 2024, and he could say, well, actually, I meant this in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, but I think the church is in a position to like, well, we don't care what you meant. Like, this is scripture now. And I kind of feel that way about Bonhoeffer. That he belongs to the community of saints. His work belongs to the church. And that's not to disrespect his family. But the church is the ultimate arbiter of what his work means now.
I think I'm happy with that, as long as we can also specify that him belonging to the church shouldn't involve wrapping a halo around him.
Yeah.
In fact, it's precisely where that halo should come off, and we say we can speak straightforwardly and truly about him. I mean, just like Christians, instead of sort of speaking in awe of St. Paul, should say, Paul, yeah, hard man, difficult. or my goodness, maybe now we have enough historical distance to say that Cyril of Alexandria was both absolutely essential and really a jerk. And so he becomes more easily relatable as we difficult saints, which those of us who've been in ministry know we've only had churches full of really difficult saints.
So, Adam, when you think of Bonhoeffer's work, besides Discipleship or Life Together, which I feel like are the two books that people dare to read, you know, where do you point people?
Oof. So here is where I've got friends who are just much better read in Bonhoeffer. So I'm going to point around to tidbits and dribs and drabs over.
Yeah, no, I'm just interested in Adam, the Lutheran pastor. Like,
I think he gives a wonderful and interesting statement of Lutheran Christology. I think he says some extraordinary things about baptism, and I can't even recall where exactly they're located. I mean, it's this wonderful apocalyptic stuff on baptism that's clearly on one level it's straight out of Luther, and another put in a really sort of fresh, modern way. I mean, there are even a lot of people are annoyed by the letters and papers from prison. Partially, it's easy to get annoyed with them by way of this is sort of unedited material, and it's formally been edited, but I mean not by him, and it's also
another wedding sermon.
Yeah, right. Well, it's also the use it's been put to, right? Whereas this is the favorite source material for radical theology and team, God is dead. And like if there were two things in the 20th century that mattered to those guys, it would be, certain chunks of Tillich and that. And that's clearly not faithful to what Bonhoeffer was about. But the truth is, broadly speaking, he is a creative and courageous, and here I don't just mean personally courageous, but I mean bold in his way of putting things. Can be abrasive, can be interesting. Careful thinking Lutheran theologian who's worth your time, but he takes time. But I'm absolutely not the best guy to point out exactly here are the right spots. Like I don't have a series of Bonhoeffer volumes sitting above my desk here.
I have some in a basket on the floor over here.
There you go. I think mine are actually in storage in the United States. A lot of them.
You didn't bring them with you.
Do you want to know how many boxes of books I didn't bring?
It's expensive to move to Europe.
It really is. So I made some choices, and I brought a minimum of books. And maybe I'm getting to the point where I can have them shipped over, but no, we're not there yet. This might encourage me.
Todd, what's on your mind here?
I think that the thing I think about is while I would be as interested in as whether it's Adam or another pointing to some good bits to read in Bonhoeffer, I really think that we probably still need to insist that know something of the time, and I think that that calls attention to our own, in that it's very easy to get sucked into one direction or another, discounting the complexity of our own history. That to be fair, or maybe to be more hospitable, we probably should take into account some of that. It was something you said on Monday night that kind of still has ringing in my ear that fits here, and that is that it's very easy for us to decide, make a judgment, and forget about how that judgment works in the other direction. And so we probably going to get caught in our own whipsaws if we're not careful. And if we're trying to adjudicate or determine, discern, I think is probably the better word, how to go forward. Uh, it just takes work, and it takes time, and both of those, that particular kind of work and that particular amount of time, I think, are worthwhile because people are listening to us and people are watching.
Yeah. Yeah. Am I happy that it seems as though Eric Metaxas's biography of Bonhoeffer keeps showing up in random places in my church? Like, no. Neither am I happy that I keep finding John MacArthur study Bibles in different Sunday school classrooms. Like it just happens, right? And I think I've been most uncomfortable with seeing clergy encouraging people not to see a movie, which maybe I'd be more comfortable with it if that was like standard clergy practice. But it just I just weary of making everything part of our culture war, and now clergy casting themselves in the role of censor just doesn't seem theologically sound to me.
Well, along those lines, I had one of our folks message me and say, "Hey, do you think this is a good biography?" I didn't make any public declaration. I didn't say you should or shouldn't go see, but she said, and it was the Metaxas biography, and I said, well, if you really want to read a biography, that's probably not the one I would read. And so I made a suggestion, and then it was, well, this movie's coming out, and I thought, and I said, I don't really know anything about the movie. Here are a couple of articles about it. And I think so long as you go into it knowing that it's a movie, it might be okay. So I think that pronouncements are easy. Well, I don't know if they're. I guess for some they're very easy to make. But I think if I'm going to suggest that we take time and do work, then I probably ought to give some illustrations of it's going to take you time and some work. So if you want me to do it for you, that's what lops us in, or that's what gives us sort of the sense that we ought to be making pronouncements. But if instead I'm going to do work and I'm going to take time, then I'll invite you. Here's how to do some work and take some time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's far better.
And I think, speaking of time, for a lot of people, the Metaxas biography is probably the biggest book they've ever read.
No kidding.
So maybe we shouldn't just shit all over the effort that people have put into.
Yeah.
And Adam, this brings me. I haven't asked you this before, but I am curious. As a Lutheran, Luther himself is another figure. It, almost to an exaggerated extent.
Yeah, probably the most. I mean, the most written about single figure in the last 1,000 years, easily.
Yeah. So, what do you do with the good and the awful?
It's really interesting. I mean, Luther's monumental. Any person really is if you get to see a lot of them, right? A person's a huge thing to swallow at once. None of us are simple. But I mean, the Weimar edition of Luther is, and admittedly, that's all the critical notations and everything else. It's still 30 million words.
Mm-hmm.
It's this mountain sitting on a bookshelf. He's given us so much of himself. And then there's all the centuries of opinions about Luther. And so encountering the real guy can be bracing, infuriating, funny, deeply moving, sometimes just confusing.
Hmm.
But at least you get the sense that, oh, I'm dealing with a real human being here who's much too large for my ideas of him.
Yeah, I was thinking,
That's a line.
Todd and I both went to the Holocaust Museum, Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, and there's as you go in, there's a picture of Luther with one quote about the Jews, and and certainly that's not the place you want to quibble with with how Luther is portrayed, but one sentence out of 30 million words it's hard to sort all that out.
It is. And it's not only not the only sentence he wrote about the Jews, but it's also not the straightforward consensus of all Jewish scholarship on Luther. There are some interesting appraisals. Read a rather fine book on the history of the Hebrew language, and it included accurately the statement, and a whole little, small section on Luther and early Lutherans and their influence. And it said, Luther's not philo-Semitic, but actually he's a huge friend of the Hebrew language and does some really interesting and helpful things here. And so once even Jewish readings of Luther get sort of sufficiently detailed, they get complicated. But I would hope that's most of the time going to be the case about anybody. The question is, how do you introduce someone to something or somebody like that? Where do I tell somebody to start with Luther? It's hard. I suppose you got to start somewhere. And so, I read this biography at first. Is it the best one? I don't know. Start somewhere. But know that getting to know another human being, living or dead, is a slow process.
That's really, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really good word. So where, Adam, your professional interests are? Where are they right now?
Where are they right now? They're still on Luther in part. And I had a research project on kind of reverberations of Luther, unexpected reverberations of Luther in modern philosophical territory, or sort of borderlands between modern philosophy and theology, having to do with concepts of voice and speech and life.
Okay.
So I'm still kind of plucking away at a book on that. I'm happy with what I've got down. I'm also just teaching a lot these days, and sort of new stuff all the time. And so I don't necessarily have a lot of time for my own writing. But that's okay. That's part of the job. That's part of life. And you learn by doing that.
Are you celebrating Thanksgiving overseas?
So this is what we discovered. Our first year in the UK, we definitely did a big Thanksgiving with another American couple, a colleague of mine, and his kids. But that's a work day for us over here. And as it turns out, even if you think we get everything prepped, it's so much work to make that happen. So we don't really have any plans for it. We'll probably get back together, but it needs to be a thing that you kind of push to the weekend, maybe to Saturday, and then share with another couple and not let it get out of hand. Even little things like our ovens in houses are much smaller.
Yeah, I was just gonna say.
You can't buy a whole turkey and stuff it in there. You've got to be strategic about these things. So, yeah. On the other hand, my wife has ordered from our little local butcher a Christmas meat hamper.
Okay.
It's all varieties of all sorts of interesting cuts of meat, for Christmas. It's sold in this basket, but a meat hamper. I was like, you had me at meat hamper, Tasha. Christmas present? Yes.
And Tasha is clergy in the
she is, after 14 years as a pastor in the ELCA, she is a priest in the Church of England.
Okay.
Serves as part of a parish in the city center, and in the coming year she'll be taking on her own role somewhere. So I think we're going to be here for a while. We'll be somewhere in Nottingham.
And your son is how old?
He's 9 years old. He's got a funny accent that shifts between American and English during the day, like slides back and forth. and he's taking America. He's got American football as an Wednesday after school sort of club activity.
Okay.
Which he's super excited about. But it's weird that he's learning his American football in England. But whatever. So it's
cool.
It's a good sort of interesting life for us as expats. But I'll tell you, I mean, speaking of cultural sort of awareness, I've had, after the election, I had a whole bunch of friends, reach out to me in various ways. Some of them joking, a couple people saying things that were a little more serious, like, well, at least you don't have to leave the country. And I'm like, what made you think I was going to leave the country? Like, it's not for, I think differently about my Americanness living here.
How so?
I'm more aware of cultural differences. I'm more aware of ways in which the United States is, despite speaking English, is very different from the Commonwealth nations. It's not really an English-derived culture for the most part. There's far too much German and Slavic and Italian and other and everything else, and Latino and everything else influence in the United States. It's sort of foundational to our culture. And so there's a lot of things that are just differences in manners, differences in self-expression, differences in food, differences in how you get things done.
Mm-hmm.
People here don't plan. I know they think they do. Probably the English would be horrified to hear me say that. But compared to a lot of America, like Americans know how to sort of plan for an organization. I'm even watching like a big university here, and so many things just seem to be slapped together at the last second. It's not a planning culture in the way you'd think. So, but it makes me aware of all the ways in which I stand out. And so I feel like a little bit of a foreigner as soon as I open my mouth every time.
I mean, that is an interesting touch point because, I don't know that enough. There's a lot of attention paid to the impact that his time in America, and particularly the Black Church, had on Bonhoeffer. But he chose to go back, for the sake of his country and culture. And so there is a patriotism there that I don't know that we do a good job of accounting for.
It's true. It's also been a hard patriotism for post-war Germans to voice because they've been taught not to.
Mm-hmm.
So that's even a generational difference in German culture that puts him a little out of reach. But on the other hand, I think about this Russians now, right? There are people I know who are Russian expats in the West, and they want to be able to be proud of their country.
Yeah.
And it's hard for them just even to say, like, I remember one guy saying to me, because I didn't know his nationality, and I think I bumbled, and I said, he said he couldn't get back home, and I picked up the accent. I said, Ukrainian, and he's like, and he kind of makes this face, and he goes, sort of shrugs and says Russian, like half apologetically, and you're like, another one of those things like I can't imagine. What are you supposed to say to that? Sometimes Americans have it easy, but right now there's a lot of people who want to be annoyed about what's going on in America. And like, you know what? It's still my country. It's always going to be my country.
Chemtrails and all, Todd. Chemtrails and all.
Chemtrails and all.
Well, Adam, it's good to see you. Thank you
Thank you, Adam.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. This is fun. I don't get to do this much.
So and say hi to your family.
Will do. Thanks.
That was good. Yeah. Thank you, Todd, for getting up with the crack of dawn.